Good evening, Mr. Bond fans. The ink was barely dry on the deal to secure Denis Villeneuve as the director of the next Bond film before articles started flying around about this supposed Amazon wish list. That is a list of actors that the studio would find most desirable to step into the role of 007. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about a Variety article from June 27th that named Jacob Elordi, Tom Holland, and Harris Dickinson as the current favourites at the studio. Quoting directly from the article, insiders say that the studio and producers are interested in casting a British actor under the age of 30, with Jacob Elordi of Saltburn, Tom Holland of Spider-Man, and Harris Dickinson of Baby Girl at the top of the list. Elordi is Australian, of course, and the article references that, but the rest of the piece mainly covers details that we already know about the production history so far, like who the other director contenders apparently were and such, but there were a couple of other details that I thought were interesting. One concerning the search for writers. Amazon has a short list of writers who will chart the future course for the man with the license to kill as he makes his debut with Amazon after decades at MGM. One scenario making the rounds is that Jonathan Nolan, whose take on the material was enthusiastically received at Amazon, would write the screenplay. Though Nolan has a close relationship with the studio via the series Fallout, sources say he's not available to write. The other point concerns the release date. Now that Amazon has tapped Denis Villeneuve as the franchise's director, the pace is about to accelerate significantly on the 26th outing of James Bond. Even still, Amazon is looking at a 2028 release date for Bond 26. Any sooner would be impossible to pull off given the film's scale, sources say. I had been wondering whether a 2027 release date was still feasible, but I guess with Villeneuve's commitment to the Dune series, 2028 does seem like the more likely option. And if it comes out in the usual October-November slot of that year, this will quite easily mark the longest gap of time in between Bond films ever. You know, there was License to Kill to GoldenEye, then there was Spectre to No Time to Die, and you know, why did I have to be born during the era where it's these incredibly long gaps between Bond films? This is so unfair. That aside, a writer does seem to me like the most logical next big appointment for the film, as that person is obviously going to be very crucial in crafting the story and the direction, and that will influence what they look for in the actor. Like, is this a Bond at the start of his career, or is this an established Bond? I'm more of a fan of the idea of the latter, conceptually speaking, at least. After the Craig era, you know, where we had 2 films which were essentially Bond Begins, and then 3 films where characters are talking about him like he's over the hill and why aren't you retired already? So the idea of having a new Bond film somewhere in the middle of all that, with a Bond who's established and at the peak of his career, is, you know, music to my ears at least. But if there's any truth to this wish list, it certainly suggests that they're going to be looking for a younger actor and therefore presumably a more rookie James Bond. Generally speaking, I do find Variety to be one of the more informed, like, you know, insider entertainment sources, and they certainly lead the charge in a lot of ways, I think. But they're certainly not immune to posting some clickbait stuff, and I have seen other entertainment journalists disregarding this Variety article. Jeff Snyder, for instance, on Twitter was tweeting. So he reposted the article and then said, "Tom Holland is not going to be James Bond. Don't need to be a 6-figure reporter at Variety to know that one." And then he followed that up with, "There is no Bond shortlist. Doesn't exist. I warned you yesterday about this. People are just grasping at straws to film column inches and drive traffic." And indeed, I wasn't actually going to make a video talking about this because it did just sort of like strike me as like, okay, well, this is more just sort of hypothesizing. It's some of the same names that we've been seeing for years now, but it did gain enough traction throughout the internet that I figured like, okay, well, what the hell, it's been a little while since I made a video about the prospective candidates for the next era of Bond, so let's talk about them. Starting with Tom Holland, who is obviously the most prolific actor on this particular list. He's already Spider-Man, he's already probably quite an expensive movie star to get on board your projects, which I think immediately kind of rules him out of any serious consideration here. Though that being said, the actor does have some previous history with wanting to be Bond. There was an article from a while ago, if you remember, where he was pitching to Sony executives his idea for like a young kind of like Bond Begins story, where you would only realize that he was actually James Bond at the very end of the film. Like, it'd be a big twist at the end that he goes into M's office and he's like, "You are James Bond 007," kind of thing, and the audience would be like, so bowled over by it, which is really strange to me, because then presumably you wouldn't be able to market the film as being a James Bond film if you want it to be some big surprise at the end. Perhaps unsurprisingly, executives were not keen on this idea, apparently. I've seen Tom Holland in a bunch of stuff outside of Spider-Man as well. I mean, The Impossible I saw at the cinema when that first came out, one of his big, I guess his first real big breakout kind of role. In the Heart of the Sea I've seen, what else? All of his Spider-Man stuff. Cherry I watched, Uncharted. In every role that I've seen him in, he does sort of exude this youth, this boyish sort of charm, and there are action sequences. He'll do something ridiculous in one of the Spider-Man films and then be like, can you believe I just jumped off that building onto an alien spaceship and piloted it out into the sea where the alien came out onto the top and had a fight with him? And, it's that sort of fourth wall breaking, like, call-out stuff that, I think, it's overdone these days, I think, as a style, but I think the Bond films generally have always done it really well, where the Bond actor will generally be in some sort of ridiculous scenario and then just sort of, toss it off casually. Skyfall being a prime example, Craig jumping off the digger onto the train, and then he just does his cuffs and carries on. And if that were Tom Holland, I can't imagine it being anything other than, like, pulling a face and doing a double take and, like, can you believe I just did that kind of thing? Maybe I'm being unfair because, I think he is a good actor. I think he is a very good actor. But I don't know if I really see him in the tuxedo. If I'm going to be ranking these three actors, he's the one that I would put at the bottom of who I would most like to see as James Bond out of these three. But then on the flip side, we have Harris Dickinson, who is an actor that I've talked about before in one of these videos. He's not necessarily a household name, but he does crop up in the could-be Bond potential circles every now and then. I think there was a video in, like, 2022 when I mentioned him, because he's in news articles and stuff. His name pops up a fair bit, and I think that he is a far more likely prospect for the role, and he has the exact kind of profile that someone would traditionally have for being cast as Bond. That is to say, they have a solid body of work behind them without necessarily having that one kind of big, iconic, sort of like cinematic role like I think Tom Holland does with Spider-Man. Tom Holland is Spider-Man. Harris Dickinson is, well, he's been in stuff. I've seen him in a fair few films. I saw Beach Rats, Triangle of Sadness. He was in The King's Man. He had quite a prominent part in that. I would imagine that that's what a lot of... I think that's probably his biggest kind of... I mean, he was in the... I've not seen The Iron Claw or Baby Girl. I've heard reports that he's very good in both of those. But I do think that The King's Man is probably his most mainstream kind of big action. I know that The King's Man didn't necessarily do terribly well at the box office or review-wise, but in terms of that kind of, he's shirtless, he's doing action stuff in that film, and I do think that he's a really great actor. I would be interested to see him, because I've never quite seen him in kind of a debonair sort of role. I would be interesting to see him in something where he has a bit more charm. Maybe Baby Girl's the film that I need to see for that. I know that that's quite a horny film. I think it's him and Nicole Kidman in some kind of like age gap relationship thing, right? Let me know below if you've seen it, if it's worth me checking it out. And then finally we have Jacob Elordi, who is probably the second biggest name out of these people. I mean, maybe even the biggest name. Maybe he eclipses Tom Holland now, I don't really know, but he is the actor that I am least familiar with of this selection. I have seen Saltburn, and I liked him in Saltburn. Rosamund Pike played his mother, and I would quite like the idea of Rosamund Pike coming in as M, so maybe Jacob Elordi as Bond, Rosamund Pike as M could, recreate some of that dynamic, perhaps. Oh, I tell a lie, he's in Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Men Tell No Tales as uncredited extra. So I have seen him in 2 films. He's an actor with, I think, a bit of a generational sort of following. So I think if, he's like, I do think of him as being a celebrity as well as an actor. I see him pop up on my newsfeed and whatever because he's, stuns at the Met Gala and things like that, where I don't have that with the likes of Harris Dickinson, for example. So yeah, I think he's got a bit of a generational following. I know he was in Euphoria, which is quite popular. I watched 1 episode of it, and I, generally speaking, this is a bit of a tangent, but generally speaking, when it comes to film and TV shows and stuff, I don't stick to just one genre. I watch a lot of films of broad demographics and audience focuses and all that kind of thing. But Euphoria was something that I watched and I was like, oh, this is for a different generation to mine. And I think it's sometimes when you watch something and you're kind of like, I'm not the target for this, and I can imagine it speaking much more to somewhat of a slightly different generation, demographic, whatever you want to say. And Euphoria was one of those moments where I was like, I'm too old for this. Maybe that's my personal hang-up. I had Skins when I was of that age, you know, so I'm not, you know, I'm sure it's great as well, and I'm sure that people of all ages can enjoy it. Maybe I should give it another go, but that was my takeaway from just seeing a single episode a while back now. So with that in mind, like, I know he's gonna be Heathcliff in an upcoming Wuthering Heights adaptation. He's gonna be Frankenstein's monster in Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein, which I'm definitely going to be seeing, so I will see him in that. If I were to rate him and Harris Dickinson would be at the top of my list of these three by a considerable margin, and then Jacob Elordi would be in the middle. As I say, I don't know how much to take from this. Perhaps these names aren't exactly on the list, but hey, maybe Amazon are going for a younger James Bond. It's gonna be similar to the First Light video game in a way, I think, and I don't know how I feel about the idea that we're gonna have a video game and a movie that are both sort of dealing with a Bond at the very start of his career. I would maybe like one of them to be different, but hey, so maybe the article is more of an indication of a direction rather than specific names. Let me know in the comments section below what you think about this. Let me know your own ranking of these particular three actors. But yeah, it is one of those things where I'm like, maybe the exact details in this aren't necessarily to be taken as gospel, but maybe a sort of more broad theme is emerging. But as I say, do let me know below. And also below, please do consider clicking the subscribe button and the Mrs. Bell notification button to stay up to date on future video uploads. There's a variety of links to my social medias below, so do follow me on those platforms as well if you care to do so. And with all that being said, so long for now, Bond fans.